On September 21st, 2024, Sri Lanka gathered for a presidential election. The ballot was full of familiar names. Among the major candidates were the incumbent president, the leader of the opposition, and the son of a former president. And then there was also Anura Kumara Dissanayake, known mercifully to bogan commentators simply as AKD. AKD was a left-field candidate representing the Marxist JVP party and lacking the same insider resumes his opponents had. The results from the first round of voting came in. Nobody had the majority they needed, and the top two candidates went on to a second round of vote counting. The incumbent president finished third and was consequently eliminated, the leader of the opposition came in second, and in first place, miraculously, Marxist candidate AKD had 42% of the vote. This marked a historic event for the nation. It was the first time a second round of counting had ever occurred in Sri Lanka's history. The next day, the results of the second round were conclusive. AKD took the presidency with 56% of the vote. The results indicated a major shift in Sri Lanka's political status quo. Not only was it the first second count, it was also the first time a third-party candidate had ever won the presidency. And given Sri Lanka's turbulent economic state, people are eager to see where the new president will take the country. But there are also concerns about Sri Lanka's status internationally. Amidst an ongoing push-pull between India and China for influence over Sri Lanka, India's recent rise in popularity, and AKD's party history of pro-Chinese sentiment and Marxist alignment, does his election signify a changing wind blowing through the Eastern powers? So now this election has come to an end, it's worth asking how this political shock could affect the East. In order to understand this election's significance both domestically and internationally, we'll have to, as always, look at a few key details. What makes AKD's election so unique? What roles do China and India play in Sri Lanka's revitalisation efforts? And finally, how likely is it for AKD and his party to implement pro-Chinese Marxist policies? Sri Lanka's recent lineage of presidents reads like a who's who of the political elite. In the past 2 decades, Sri Lanka has had 4 presidents, 3 of whom have had personal history working in their favour. Now, apologies in advance for my pronunciation of these names, but there was Mahinda Rajapaksa, who came from a long lineage of political figures. His father was a state councillor and an MP, and his grandfather was a Vedanaarachi, an integral position in the native headman system during Sri Lanka's colonial era. There was Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda's younger brother, and then there was Ranil Wickremesinghe, whose family includes 2 chief justices, 2 prime ministers, and 2 presidents. To many Sri Lankans, this lineup reeked of corruption. They were well aware that a political climate comprised of inner circles and rich families with rich friends doesn't tend to prioritise the general population's interests. By the time Sri Lanka's economy collapsed in 2022, they were understandably over it. Protests promptly broke out across the country demanding that the president step down, an election was called and AKD took the scene. And given his history, it's not surprising that he was attractive to voters looking for a shake-up. AKD was born in Galawila, a rural village in Sri Lanka's central province. His father was a low-level office worker paid on a daily wage, and his family history was agricultural, not political. He was the first student from his school to gain university entrance, where he joined both the Socialist Students' Union and the student wing of the JVP. Although he ultimately ended up leaving school to go into hiding. At the time, JVP was engaged in a violent insurrection and 6,700 Sri Lankans were killed by insurgents during the conflict. In response, retaliatory violence broke out against JVP members and even loose associates. AKD's family, who were relatively apolitical themselves, were harassed and their house was burnt down. His cousin was also ultimately arrested, tortured and killed during the conflict. AKD later apologised and disavowed the insurrection, and the JVP would call off violence altogether. Instead of seizing power, their attention shifted to winning it. And clearly Sri Lankan voters wouldn't see either AKD or JVP's history as any nail in the coffin. AKD's election marks a victory for the fairly small JVP party, but their struggles continue as AKD is now tasked with managing governmental corruption, a post-collapsed economy, and when it comes to Sri Lanka's foreign affairs, AKD is caught between a rock and a hard place. Given the state of Sri Lanka's economy, the country is going to need foreign support in their efforts to revitalise the economy. The question on the world's mind is whether they'll pivot towards China or India. Both countries already have extant relationships with Sri Lanka, geographic proximity and strategic interests in continuing their relationship. And Sri Lanka has a lot to gain from a relationship with either one, as well as unique drawbacks. Sri Lanka has become a valuable country to China in their ongoing Belt and Road Initiative, a troubled megaproject focused on creating a connecting trade network of maritime and overland routes through Asia and Europe. The benefits for participating countries are apparent. With more trading routes and developing trading hubs, transportation times and costs will see a reduction that ideally leads to economic gains for everyone. And China's interest in Sri Lanka is not simply as just another country within the wider network. In a time where over 80% of global trade happens through maritime routes, Sri Lanka's ports are a keystone in connecting global trade. Sri Lanka's port of Colombo is the largest port in the Indian Ocean and serves to connect Europe and Asia. As a consequence, China has invested in the port of Colombo's development, as well as the construction of the Hambantota port, which is near the busiest sea route in the area and is expected to become the second largest port in the country. And Sri Lanka has personal skin in the game here. Currently, Sri Lanka receives 21.9% of its imports from China, making it its #1 import partner, and they receive everything from electrical machinery to textiles to raw materials to ships, boats and vehicles. That's just one of the myriad of benefits for Sri Lanka. Since joining the BRI, Chinese citizens have become an increasing portion of Sri Lanka's tourist population, growing by over 70% from 2010 to 2016, and making up 6.4% of all tourists this year so far. The development of maritime infrastructure also means that Sri Lanka can explore more of its exclusive economic zone, a radius of 200 miles around the island, and possibly tap into natural resources in the area. And as part of the BRI, Sri Lanka and China aim to build a new city, which would operate as a financial centre along the Colombo coastline, and it's expected to create upwards of 80,000 jobs. China also put a good foot forward in Sri Lanka initially. Sri Lanka struggled with attracting foreign direct investment for a long time, until 2011 when there was a sudden rise in investment, with a significant part of that coming from China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. From 2011 to 2015, China was Sri Lanka's #1 source of investment, providing an amount equivalent to $989 million US. That's 15.5% of all of Sri Lanka's FDI received. The issue for Sri Lanka, however, is also the Belt and Road Initiative. This is because the BRI operates by China giving member countries loans for their domestic projects, and given the relatively small interest rates charged, it's expected that the financial returns created by domestic development will help the countries pay it back. And that might have been fine under normal circumstances. But as we know, Sri Lanka's economy isn't really dealing with normal circumstances. What became clear after 2022 is that while Sri Lanka's participation in the BRI carries many possible benefits, the debt involved is still debt at the end of the day, and Sri Lanka might not be able to rely on China as a partner during a crisis. India, on the other hand, has been able to gain some popularity on the island after the economic crisis. In 2023, India provided assistance worth roughly $4 billion US, and unlike Chinese investments, India's financial support comes primarily in the form of credit and currency swaps, which are much more reliable for a country in economic instability. India also responded to Sri Lanka's shortage of necessary goods, sending over ships of food and medicine when they were needed the most. India's essentially been able to take a bad situation and sell themselves as an important ally, one that will be there for Sri Lanka in its hour of need. If that's the case, Sri Lanka definitely doesn't want to sever any ties with India for good in case the need for support arises again. But it would be a gross oversimplification to say that the importance of an India-Sri Lanka relationship is solely based on the last 2 years. The two countries have always had a tight bond, especially given how geographically close they are and the overlap in their population demographics and culture. There's a certain cultural impetus for staying close. And while we mentioned that China leads in Sri Lanka's import market, it's not like India is absent there. They're actually Sri Lanka's second largest import partner, making up 19.6% of all imports, which is nothing to scoff at compared to China's 21.9%. There's also a lot of interest in connecting India's power grid with Sri Lanka. Conversations about that began around a decade ago and never seemed to go anywhere, but the project has recently picked up steam and Sri Lanka would have a lot to lose if the project fell through. For one, India has some of the cheapest energy in the world, and a connected power grid would obviously allow Sri Lanka to get their share of the cake. But Sri Lanka is also steadily working on unlocking its potential for offshore wind power that it could easily export to India if the grids were connected. And the connection would be a key element in attracting private sector investors, since a direct line to sell to India would naturally increase the market for Sri Lanka's budding energy sector. Now, it's probably worth noting that while China has a specific interest in their relationship to Sri Lanka, India both has a vested interest in their relationship and a vested interest in keeping China out of Sri Lanka. The worry is that as China continues to invest in Sri Lanka's ports specifically, they might take any failure to repay as a chance to seize the ports. That would possibly give China the ability to get their naval ships into Sri Lanka, which would put them too close for comfort for many of the vital nuclear and specific installations in southern India. There's a general wariness in Sri Lanka towards anything perceived as India gaining undue influence over the country. However, and this needs to be considered when discussing their relations, this traces all the way back to the 80s. In very brief terms, some members of Sri Lanka's Tamil population at the time formed the LTTE, a separatist group, and then began an insurgency in order to further their cause when the going got rough. Many members of the LTTE fled to the state of Tamil Nadu in India, and some Sri Lankans today still believe that India was housing, funding, and training those that fled. This has created some anxieties about India interfering with Sri Lanka, and many people who remember the LTTE insurgency want to keep India at a distance. What makes this whole situation even messier is not just that Sri Lanka has to manage its own domestic situation and their foreign relationships, but that they have to do this while India and China are at each other's throats. In an ideal world, Sri Lanka would be able to build both relationships and maximise the included benefits. But like any good throuple, any perceived favouritism towards one country is sure to create tensions with another. So what is the country to do? While we're not in the business of making predictions, we can go over some of the practicalities involved for the new president. As well as having a president, Sri Lanka's government also has a parliament responsible for creating legislation. When he was elected, AKD's control over the parliament was tenuous. There is a total of 225 members, and the JVP only had a whopping 3. However, after the presidential election, AKD called for a snap parliamentary election, and the coalition his party was part of won an incredible 159 seats, which is more seats than any political party has won in Sri Lanka's entire history. That majority is obviously crucial for AKD's ability to make changes to the status quo. In the past, it wasn't uncommon for politicians to buy the opposition's votes in order to manage a minority parliament. But since AKD ran on an anti-corruption platform, he would have to compromise with his peers across the aisle if he hadn't won a majority. And since the opposition in question is still made up of Sri Lanka's political elite, any radical changes probably would have been off the table. But AKD still needs to compromise with his coalition, which is comprised of 21 parties and entities. And while members of the National People's Power are generally united under both feminist and socialist political ideals, there are still diverging opinions throughout which need to be considered as JVP moves forward. When it comes to foreign affairs, it's difficult to predict anything. Analysts have noted that AKD seems dedicated to keeping both China and India at an equal distance. There's a possibility that China will win back the favour that it lost after 2022. For example, take a look at the Hambantota port we mentioned earlier. Initially, the port failed to perform economically and was seen as proof that China's loans were more of a debt trap than a chance at global connectivity. However, the port has started to see increased revenue and is on track to expand beyond the trade sector by accommodating cruise ships as well. And AKD is keeping in tradition when it comes to being sceptical of India's intentions. During his campaign, he promised to shut down a wind power project backed by Gautam Adani, an Indian billionaire with ties to Prime Minister Modi, accusing the project of being corrupt. And ultimately, while we've shown that Sri Lanka has a lot to gain from its foreign relations, it's probably true that AKD will fight to keep distance from either country. Given the difficult situation he's been put in, the real question might not be how Sri Lanka manages its ties with its neighbours, but how it maintains its independence beyond the shadow of two giants. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.